Welcome to Last Records. Today we're looking at people whose dumb decisions turned a normal day at the zoo into their final mistake. From a clout-chasing creator hooking a massive snake inside its enclosure, to a man who scaled a restricted wall to save a choking seal, ending his trip in the craziest way possible. It was May 18th, 2019, in Phoenix, Arizona. The local zoo had just closed for the night, and the walkways were empty except for a few workers heading home. Out near the reptile building, there was a back door for staff that did not always shut all the way. The man who slipped through that door was named Irvin Knott. He was 27 years old and worked at a shipping warehouse loading boxes during the week. In his free time, he made videos about reptiles at home. People who watched him said he handled them roughly and ignored anyone who told him to be careful. When folks online warned him he'd get hurt one day, he laughed it off. Irvin liked to say venomous snakes were just normal snakes with better marketing. He came to the zoo alone that night with his phone and a snake hook he'd bought online, hoping to film something that nobody else had. I get the thrill of wanting that one clip nobody else has. I've chased moments for videos before too, but when people who know snakes are telling you to slow down, that's the moment you should have listened, not laughed. He waited until the announcements ended. Then he walked along the back wall, trying doors, until he discovered a service entrance that had been left unsecured after maintenance work earlier that evening. Nobody pushed him through it. Inside, he found a room full of enclosures. One had a large warning on the glass, marking the snake as highly venomous. That was the one he picked. It looked the most dangerous, and to him, that meant the most views, because rare gets attention. But the rarest looking snake in that room was rare for a reason, and the sign was trying to tell him exactly that. He set his phone to record. Using the hook, he lifted the snake out and draped it across his shoulders. The animal didn't want to be there. It kept trying to slide away, coiling and shifting, sending him every signal it had. He just kept yanking it back. Then he tried to turn its head toward the lens for a better shot. His grip slipped. The snake bit him once on the left forearm. A second later, it struck his thumb. He let go, and the animal dropped and vanished beneath the enclosures. Then he made the choice that really cost him. Instead of running for the door or calling for help while he still could, he picked the phone back up and kept filming. At first, he acted like the bites were nothing. He laughed, showed the puncture marks to the camera, and kept talking. Those were the minutes that might have changed everything that followed. The pain spread through his arm. His hand began to swell. Sweat formed on his forehead. His voice lost some of its confidence. Even then, he stayed focused on getting footage. Nearly 20 minutes after the bites, he finally decided it was time to leave. By then, he was dizzy and nauseated. He stopped recording and headed toward the exit. At first, he moved quickly, but the farther he went, the harder walking became. Security cameras later showed him stopping several times in the service hallways, leaning against walls and struggling to steady himself. His breathing grew heavier. His legs felt weaker. He continued forward, trying to reach a way out, but his body was no longer cooperating. By the time he reached a locked service door, he was barely able to stay upright. He reached for the handle, stumbled, and collapsed beside it. Security staff found him there sometime later and called for emergency help. He was still alive when paramedics arrived, but his condition continued to worsen during the trip to the hospital. Doctors worked to save him, but the damage caused by the venom was too severe. Several hours after the bites, Irvin died. Workers later recovered his phone, which still contained the recording. Investigators determined that he had entered a restricted area, removed a venomous snake from its enclosure without authorization, and caused the bites himself. The death was ruled an accident, and the case was closed. The next story follows someone whose plan depended on believing she understood an animal she had never worked with. It was August 11, 2021, in Columbus, Ohio. Behind the chimpanzee exhibit was a staff-only area where zoo workers cared for the animals away from the public. Most visitors never thought about what happened back there, but that afternoon, a woman named Janna Prather was looking for a way inside. Janna was 34 years old and made money buying and reselling things online. Friends described her as someone who was always chasing the next big opportunity and often convinced herself that risky ideas would work out. For months, she obsessed over stories of exotic animals selling for huge sums and convinced herself a young chimp could make her rich. The problem was that she knew almost nothing about animals. She had never worked with primates, had no practical way to transport a chimpanzee, and no training in animal handling. Despite that, she spent weeks watching videos and reading online discussions until she believed she knew enough to pull off her plan. Rather than obtaining a professional tranquilizer, she pieced together a makeshift sedative plan using veterinary medications she had acquired through questionable online sellers and private contacts. She had no way to verify the drugs, the dosage, or even whether they would work as intended, but convinced herself they would be enough. I'll be honest, the part that gets me is how casually she treated this. She talked about stealing a wild animal the same way most people talk about flipping a couch. Janna chose to act during normal zoo hours, believing the crowds would help her blend in. She entered with her equipment hidden in a backpack and spent hours watching the chimpanzee area. During that time, she noticed a service corridor that employees repeatedly used while transporting supplies. Late in the afternoon, when several workers were focused on a routine task nearby, she slipped through an unsecured service door before it fully closed behind them. Once inside, she moved quickly through back-of-house hallways, relying on confidence and luck more than any real plan. Employees who saw her assumed she was with another department or had been authorized to be there, allowing her to move farther into the restricted area than she should have. As she moved through the area, she recorded herself for a small group of followers, joking about how much money she expected to make from the theft.
Eventually, she reached a work area next to the chimp holding rooms where she could see one of the adult chimpanzees through the barriers.
Believing her plan was finally coming together, she loaded a dart and fired it into the animal's shoulder. The chimp reacted immediately, but remained active while Janna waited nearby. The shot caused an immediate commotion. The chimp vocalized loudly and began moving erratically through the holding area. Nearby staff heard the disturbance and quickly recognized that something was wrong. Within minutes, employees were checking radios, looking for the source of the noise, and moving toward the holding section to investigate. Several workers knew the animal had not been scheduled for any medical procedure, making the presence of a dart especially alarming. What she failed to understand was that sedating a large animal is far more complicated than it looks online. After only a few minutes, she convinced herself the chimp was safely unconscious. Believing the animal could no longer fight back, she moved deeper into the staff area and approached a gate used by workers when moving animals between sections. The confusion created by the unexpected darting incident briefly worked in her favor. While staff were still trying to determine what had happened and where the unauthorized person had gone, she managed to reach the transfer area before anyone physically intercepted her. She had no idea how the system worked and saw the gate as the final obstacle between herself and the money she imagined she was about to make. The moment she opened it, she learned she was wrong. The chimp was fully awake, agitated from being struck by the dart, and capable of moving far faster than she expected. It rushed forward before she could react, knocking her onto the concrete floor. By this point, employees responding to the earlier disturbance were already converging on the area. Several heard the gate operation and the sudden escalation of noise moments before the attack began. Workers nearby later reported hearing shouting and loud impacts, but by the time anyone reached the area, the attack was already underway. Janna tried to get away, but she had put herself into a situation she never understood. The chimp quickly overpowered her, inflicting severe bite wounds and blunt force injuries while staff rushed to respond. Workers immediately began emergency procedures, but controlling a large chimpanzee during an active attack was extremely difficult.
A chimpanzee is significantly stronger than the average person, and she walked into that situation with nothing but assumptions and a plan that only existed in her own head.
By the time employees secured the animal, paramedics were already on their way. Janna had suffered catastrophic injuries and severe blood loss. She was rushed to the hospital in critical condition, but was pronounced dead a short time later. Investigators recovered the dart launcher, suspected sedatives, and other equipment from Janna's backpack. Authorities concluded that her attempt to sedate and steal a chimpanzee led directly to the fatal encounter. The chimp survived the incident without lasting effects, and the area was temporarily closed while zoo officials reviewed security procedures. Janna's mistake came from believing she knew more than she did. Dallas's story begins with a decision that seemed harmless at first. It was July 4, 2018, in Knoxville, Tennessee. Near the bear exhibit, a low safety rail separated visitors from a deep maintenance trench that most people barely noticed. That gap is what this story comes down to. The young man at the center of it was Dallas Fite, a 22-year-old auto shop worker who liked showing off. That afternoon, he came to the zoo with friends and a handful of firecrackers in his backpack, joking that he was going to set one off near the animals.
Right away, I knew the type of person he was, the one who always needed attention and couldn't walk away from a dare, even when it was clearly a bad idea.
The group made their way to the bear exhibit, and Dallas started getting louder about his plan. A staff member nearby heard him and told him plainly not to throw anything into the enclosure. For a second, it looked like that might be the end of it, but his friends started teasing him, asking if he was scared of getting caught, and that was all it took. Dallas said he wasn't afraid of anyone, pulled out a firecracker, lit it, and tossed it over into the habitat. It popped and startled one of the bears, and his friends laughed and egged him on to do it again. This is the part that always gets me. A grown adult had just told him to stop, and instead of listening, he listened to the laughing instead. Some people are more scared of looking weak in front of their friends than they are of any real danger. Wanting to top himself, Dallas pulled out a second firecracker. To get a better throw, he stepped up onto the lower safety rail and steadied himself there, now standing right at the edge of that hidden trench. He lit it and threw, and this one went off closer to the animal. The bear charged toward the front fence, and people nearby backed away fast. But Dallas wasn't watching the bear. He turned around to catch his friend's reactions, grinning, soaking up the moment. While he was turned around on that rail, he stepped backward. His foot found nothing but air. He fell roughly 12 feet down into the maintenance trench between the visitor barrier and the animal fence. On the way down, his head struck a concrete support. People standing close by heard the impact. His friends rushed to the edge of the trench. It's strange how fast a joke. One moment they're laughing, and the next they're staring at a friend who isn't moving. The seriousness of it didn't hit until that moment. Help came quickly, but Dallas never woke up. He died from the injuries to his head, and the bear, the animal everyone had been worried about, never touched him at all. In the days after, plenty of visitors had recorded pieces of what happened on their phones, and the videos lined up with what witnesses described. Investigators confirmed the bear never made contact, and that every bit of the harm came from the fall onto the concrete below. They determined Dallas had climbed onto the barrier on his own and lost his footing while turned away from the exhibit. There was no foul play, no equipment failure, nothing hidden. Once the review was finished, they closed the case. The medical examiner ruled the death an accident caused by blunt force head trauma. Dallas was so focused on getting a reaction from his friends that he stopped paying attention to the danger around him. Ralph's story begins with someone chasing a different kind of thrill after everyone else had gone home. It was October 9, 2017, at the Detroit Zoo in Michigan. Autumn had settled over the region, and by evening the air carried the damp chill that comes after sunset in the upper Midwest. As visitors drifted toward the exits and employees completed their final rounds, 31-year-old Ralph Marco Hurst sat hidden inside a restroom near a quiet section of the zoo. Ralph worked as a delivery driver, but his real hobby was exploring places he wasn't supposed to be. He loved abandoned buildings, restricted areas, and anywhere that offered the thrill of being somewhere off limits. Recently, he had become obsessed with the idea of spending a night locked inside of a zoo and documenting the experience. Earlier that afternoon, he had entered like any other guest and spent hours looking for a place to hide. The restroom he eventually chose sat away from the busiest areas and remained unnoticed during the final visitor sweep. For nearly an hour, he waited in silence. When he finally stepped outside, the zoo was empty. With his phone recording, he wandered through the deserted grounds, narrating the adventure he had planned for weeks. I can understand the appeal of seeing a zoo after hours, but it's easy to forget that the animals inside don't know the park is closed. For a while, everything went exactly as he had imagined. He filmed exhibits, explored empty pathways, and enjoyed having the zoo to himself. Eventually, he reached the polar bear habitat. Standing at the viewing area, he could have turned around and left with the footage he came for, but instead decided he wanted a closer look. The first fence separated visitors from restricted operational areas. Ralph climbed over it and entered a section intended only for employees. Beyond it stood another barrier overlooking the habitat. After a brief search, he found a way around it and reached an elevated maintenance walkway above the enclosure.
This is the moment I keep coming back to. He had already accomplished what he came there to do, but he decided to push a little farther.
The walkway was damp from the cool evening air. As Ralph leaned over the railing to film the habitat below, his footing slipped. The video jolted before cutting off, and he plunged more than 20 feet into the enclosure. He crashed onto rocks before tumbling into shallow water. The fall fractured his leg and left him struggling to stand. When he looked up, he saw movement on the far side of the habitat. One of the polar bears had noticed the disturbance. Ralph tried to drag himself toward a rocky section that looked climbable, but the injury made progress painfully slow. As he struggled across the enclosure, the bear steadily closed the distance. Meanwhile, sensors monitoring restricted sections of the habitat detected the disturbance and generated an alert in the zoo's security office. Staff quickly realized a person had somehow entered the enclosure and began moving toward the area, but reaching the habitat took time, and entering an occupied polar bear enclosure wasn't something they could do immediately. Ralph eventually managed to pull himself onto a low, rocky ledge, and for a brief moment, it looked as though he might escape. When he tried to climb higher, however, his injured leg gave way and sent him sliding backward. By then, the bear had closed the remaining distance. Ralph scrambled across the rocks, trying to drag himself away with his arms while the injured leg trailed behind him. The bear stepped onto the ledge and paused only briefly before moving in. When Ralph attempted to push himself upright, the animal surged forward and struck him, knocking him back onto the rocks. The impact left him unable to get away. The bear remained on top of him as he tried unsuccessfully to crawl toward higher ground. Responding personnel were still making their way to the enclosure and could not safely enter while the animal was present. By the time the staff reached a position where they could intervene, Ralph had suffered fatal injuries. He died inside the enclosure before rescuers could reach him. Investigators later reviewed security footage and evidence from the scene. They determined that Ralph had hidden inside the zoo after closing, crossed multiple restricted barriers, and accidentally fallen into the enclosure. The medical examiner ruled the death accidental, caused by traumatic injuries sustained during the polar bear attack. Following the incident, the zoo reviewed its after-hours security procedures and restricted access to the maintenance area involved. Authorities later closed the case. What stands out to me about Ralph is that he had already gotten what he came for before deciding to push further. Up next is a guy who couldn't resist proving a point after a single dare. It was March 14th, 2022, at a zoo in the Texas Panhandle. It was a warm afternoon, and the zoo had a steady crowd of people walking the paths between exhibits. In one section, a visitor railing separated guests from a service fence beyond it, and inside that enclosure were several large birds, including a few full-grown ostriches. Those barriers were there for a reason, and the decision to cross them is what the whole day came down to. The man who crossed them was Clifford Mott. He was 29 and worked at a retail store, and among his friends, he was known as the guy who simply could not say no to a dare. That afternoon, he was visiting the zoo with a group of friends, all of them in a goofy mood, and somewhere along the way, the group started joking about whether a person could actually ride an ostrich.
I've known people like Clifford, the kind who treat every dare like a challenge that they have to win. Most of the time it's harmless. Sometimes it isn't.
One of his friends turned the joke into a real challenge and dared him to try it. The others laughed and started cheering him on, and that was all the push he needed. Clifford insisted he could do it. He stepped over the visitor railing and headed toward the service fence. Ignoring the shouts behind him, he climbed over the fencing and dropped into the restricted area beyond it. A staff member spotted him almost immediately and yelled for him to come back, but he kept going. He walked directly toward one of the adult ostriches, reached for the feathers along its neck, and tried to swing himself onto its back.
A lot of people underestimate ostriches because they're birds until they find out just how much power those legs can generate.
The ostrich did not stand there and let it happen. The moment Clifford grabbed it, the bird lurched away and tried to flee. Clifford stumbled after it, still trying to hold on, and lost his balance completely. He hit the ground hard in the bird's path. Startled and cornered by the sudden movement around it, the ostrich spun back toward him. The first kick slammed into his torso and knocked him backward across the dirt. Witnesses later said he appeared dazed but conscious as he tried to crawl away. The ostrich struck again before staff could reach him. The second kick landed lower across his abdomen. People watching from behind the barriers saw him immediately clutch the area and curl onto his side. The mood around the exhibit changed in an instant. The laughter disappeared. His friends were screaming. Visitors rushed toward the railings. Several people pulled out their phones while others called emergency services. Zoo employees moved quickly to clear the area, and additional staff arrived to separate the bird from the injured man. I keep thinking about how quickly the mood must have changed. One moment everyone was laughing, and the next nobody was. Paramedics reached the scene within minutes and began treating Clifford before transporting him to the hospital. Despite those efforts, the injury had caused catastrophic internal damage and severe bleeding. Surgeons attempted emergency treatment after he arrived, but the damage was too extensive. Clifford died a short time later. Medical examination later found that the fatal injury had been caused during the attack after the bird reacted defensively to being grabbed. Investigators ultimately ruled the death an accident. Clifford ignored every barrier between himself and the animal because he wanted a story to tell. Maxine's story also starts with someone chasing the perfect moment. It was the 21st of June, 2016, in Jacksonville, Florida. Beside the tiger exhibit stood a temporary maintenance platform closed off with barriers and warning signs during electrical work. Visitors weren't supposed to be near it. That platform is what this story comes down to. Her name was Maxine Dees, 38 years old, scraping together a living as a freelance photographer who took whatever jobs came her way. She had recently entered a wildlife photography contest, and the deadline was closing in. Somewhere in her head, she decided that a plain, honest photo had no shot at winning. She wanted something that would make a judge do a double take, a clever trick of perspective that made it look like a tiger had her head in its jaws.
I understand wanting a standout photo, but at some point, getting the shot became more important than recognizing when to stop, and that's what doomed her.
From the regular viewing spots, she tried again and again to get the illusion right, crouching, leaning, reframing, but the angles never delivered what she wanted. Then her eye landed on the maintenance platform beside the exhibit. From up there, the perspective looked much closer to what she needed. Between her and that idea stood warning signs, temporary barriers, and a handful of nearby visitors who immediately told her not to go any farther. She waved off their concern, stepped around the fencing, and hauled her gear onto the platform anyway. This is the part that sticks with me. Signs can be ignored, but when multiple people tell you to stop, it's usually worth listening. Once she was up there, she began working the position, the camera pressed to her face as she tried to line up the illusion. The angle was close enough that she became convinced one more adjustment would finally give her the image she wanted. She shuffled sideways along the platform and leaned farther than she should have. At one point, she lost her footing slightly and instinctively reached out to steady herself. The platform was part of an active maintenance area. Earlier that day, technicians had been testing electrical systems connected to the exhibit, and one control panel had been left open because additional work was scheduled to continue. The area was supposed to remain off limits behind barriers while the equipment remained energized for testing. As Maxine caught herself, her hand brushed exposed components inside the open panel. Witnesses later reported hearing a loud pop as electricity arced through the contact point. The shock caused her to jerk backward in surprise and lose her balance. She stumbled backward and pitched off the side of the platform, dropping roughly 15 feet onto the hard ground below. Her camera struck first and exploded into pieces. She hit moments later with devastating force near the edge of the exhibit. Visitors screamed while others shouted for help. Staff hadn't noticed what she was doing until the crack of the electrical arc drew attention to the platform.
Emergency responders were called immediately, but the combination of the electrical injury and the traumatic fall inflicted catastrophic damage. Despite the rapid response, she was pronounced dead at the scene.
And here's the bitter twist of the whole thing. The tiger never so much as lifted itself from where it had been resting. The animal she was risking everything to feature played no part at all in how she died. Maxine spent the entire day focused on the wrong danger. The final story follows a man who became so convinced he was right that he stopped listening to everyone around him. It was September 3rd, 2015, in San Diego, California. At a seal exhibit near one of the zoo's marine mammal areas, a decorative barrier kept visitors back from the water, and signs nearby explained common seal behaviors, including the sounds they made and the way they sometimes opened their mouths while resting. The man at the center of it was Zachary Beach. He was 26 and worked at a fitness center, the kind of guy who liked being seen as the expert in any room. He had no training with marine animals, but that never stopped him from having strong opinions. That afternoon, while watching the seals, he noticed one repeatedly opening and closing its mouth.
To him, it looked like the animal was choking, and once he thought that, he couldn't let the idea go.
I've met people like Zachary. Confidence is one thing, but being so sure you're right that you stopped listening is something else entirely. The signs near the exhibit explained that the behavior was normal. Staff members came over and told him the same thing, assuring him the seal wasn't in distress. Instead of feeling relieved, Zachary got louder. He insisted the workers were ignoring an emergency and spent several minutes arguing with them. Before long, he was telling nearby visitors that he knew more about animals than the employees did. A crowd gathered around the dispute, and phones began appearing in the air as people started recording. Then Zachary did the thing nobody thought he'd actually do. He climbed over the decorative barrier and dropped into the restricted area. Staff immediately rushed toward him, shouting for him to stop and come back. But the incident unfolded almost instantly. Before they could physically intervene, he was already moving across the wet rocks near the water's edge. The rocks had been splashed by water all day and were coated with a thin layer of algae. They were never meant to be walked on. Zachary took only a few hurried steps before his footing disappeared beneath him.
The sad part to me, besides the death, is that he climbed in to rescue an animal that was never in danger and ended up being the one who actually needed saving.
He slipped forward and fell headfirst into the deeper section of the pool. On the way down, his head struck an underwater rock ledge hidden beneath the surface. The impact left him badly stunned. Witnesses later described him surfacing once, struggling to focus his eyes and having obvious difficulty keeping his head above water. Some reported seeing blood in the water near where he emerged. The seal he had been trying to help simply moved away. Zachary attempted to swim toward the edge, but his movements were uneven and uncoordinated. The blow appeared to have robbed him of both his balance and his sense of direction. He made little progress before slipping beneath the surface again. Staff reacted immediately. Rescue equipment was thrown into the pool at once, and trained personnel entered the water moments later. They reached him quickly and pulled him from the enclosure, but by then, he had already spent too long underwater. Despite emergency efforts at the scene, he was pronounced dead shortly afterward. I can't help thinking about how he spent his last minutes insisting someone needed help, never realizing that person would be him. Because the incident had begun as a loud public argument, numerous bystanders had recorded parts of it on their phones. With the circumstances clearly documented and no indication of wrongdoing by anyone else, the case was eventually closed. Investigators ruled the death accidental, caused by drowning after Zachary suffered a head injury in a fall into the seal enclosure.